This week's episode of our show has been sponsored by the Seeker's Guide to Twisted Taverns, which is a new product for 5th edition, live on Kickstarter till March 6th.
The Seeker's Guide to Twisted Tavern includes 14 new tavern locations filled with crazy NPCs, exciting clues and mysteries to explore, as well as just a lot of fun and games and revelry to improve your games of Dungeons & Dragons.
Taverns have been a cornerstone of Dungeons & Dragons campaign, and I feel like we're overdue for a good pub crawl.
Some of our amazing friends are working on this project, including Logan from Runesmith here on YouTube, as well as Eldermancy and Ghostfire Games. So please check out the Kickstarter and see all the great stuff they're working on.
They have totally blown past all their funding goals and are adding on some amazing new features to the book as we speak. So check them out right at Kickstarter by following the links below.
And now, onto this week's episode.
Greetings, my name is Monty Martin.
And I'm Kelly McLaughlin.
And we are the Dungeon Dudes. Welcome to our channel where we cover everything Dungeons & Dragons, including advice for players and guides for Dungeon Masters.
We upload new videos on Tuesdays and Thursdays, so please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Today, we are looking at part 1 of our tier rankings for the Sorcerer subclasses in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. In this episode, we will be looking at the 2 Sorcerer subclasses introduced in the Player's Handbook, which are the Draconic Bloodline and the Wild Magic Sorcerer. In our follow-up episodes that will be coming over the next couple weeks, we'll be looking at the 3 subclasses that are found in Xanathar's Guide to Everything. And then in a follow-up video, we'll also be looking at the new subclasses in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything as well.
If you look up on the screen right now, you're going to see the criteria that we use to rank the subclasses. We've pitted the subclasses against each other and not those of other classes. Keep in mind that the role-playing flavor is not a major factor in our decisions because the way that you choose to roleplay your character is defined by you and can be great no matter what subclass you choose. Also, although we might touch on some multi-classing options, it is not a core mechanic that we're looking at in our rankings.
And of course, when we are ranking the subclasses, combat is a big thing that we think about, but we also think about how the subclass is going to augment the base class's capabilities in non-combat situations as well, including exploration and negotiation, stealth, or all those other interesting situations where magic can give you the edge. It's more than just combat, although many of the Sorcerer subclasses in general tend to favor combat-focused features.
There's a lot to discuss today, so let's get rolling.
So the Sorcerer is a bit of a unique duck in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition because, first of all, they only got 2 subclasses in the Player's Handbook. And what we'll see over the course of the series is that the evolution of the Sorcerer subclass design has very much changed over the past couple of years, which I think is definitely a factor in our rankings of these 2 subclasses in particular. The other big challenge with the Sorcerer subclasses is that you gotta choose them at level 1. It's a decision that's going to define the meta magic and the spells that you choose or gain, as we'll see in some of the newer subclasses, for your character.
To kick things off, we're looking at the Draconic Bloodline Sorcerer. This is the classic sorcerer who has dragon blood flowing through their veins and is the ancestor to dragons and has that magical power fueling them. These sorcerers are in tune with the elemental magics that come from their draconic bloodlines. Depending on the draconic bloodline they are from, the elemental magics that they favor differ.
And this actually is a decision that you have to make right away when you take this subclass. You have to choose your dragon ancestor. Gold dragons and red dragons are both associated with fire, whereas blue dragons are associated with lightning energy or electric damage, black dragons being associated with poison, and so on and so forth. There's actually 10 different options to choose from, and while there's some overlap in the damage types, particularly because the metallic and the chromatic tend to be mirrors of each other, you kind of get to choose what your favorite color is.
Also, with the Draconic Sorcerer, you can now read, write, and understand the Draconic language. And on top of that, you double your proficiency bonus when you're using charisma checks to communicate with dragons.
Also, at 3rd level, dragon scales start to grow all over your body. This gives you a new AC calculation of 13 plus your dexterity modifier. This doesn't stack with mage armor or other armor that you might put on. So it's basically like having mage armor all the time. In addition to increasing your AC, your hit points also go up by 1 per level, as if you'd gotten a +2 bonus to your Constitution score.
At 6th level, you gain Elemental Affinity. If you are casting a spell of the same damage type as the Draconic origin that you have chosen, you get to add your Charisma modifier to one of the damage rolls. You can also spend 1 sorcery point to gain resistance to that damage type for an hour.
Now, the important thing to note about this feature is that it only applies to 1 damage roll. So, for example, if you're using a spell like Scorching Ray, which fires 3 rays, you don't get to add your Charisma modifier to each ray. You only get to add it once. Or if you're casting a spell like Cloud Kill, that damage bonus only applies once. It doesn't apply to every round of that spell. This was actually an errata or a clarification that came out in Sage Advice, and it actually dramatically makes this feature a lot less powerful.
At 14th level, you gain Dragon Wings. You can now sprout these wings as a bonus action and have a flying speed equal to your walking speed, and you can put them away whenever you want, but it's not going to work if you're wearing armor.
Finally, at level 18, you gain the Draconic Presence power, which allows you to tap into the frightful and alluring aura of some dragons. You spend 5 sorcery points to activate this power, and it works like a spell that you have to concentrate on. So you have to concentrate on the effect for 1 minute. All the creatures that are in range of this ability have to make a wisdom saving throw against your spell saving throw DC, and if they fail, you can either choose whether they are charmed or frightened based on whether you want to project Draconic Awe or Draconic Fear. Creatures make this saving throw whenever they start their turn in range of your aura, but once they succeed this saving throw, they are immune to it for 24 hours.
So the Draconic Bloodline Sorcerer represents one of the more standard sorcerer options and the one that we all kind of imagine in the worlds of Dungeons & Dragons. They make excellent blasters, and I think that is something to be said for them, is they really drive home this blaster mage sort of idea. One of the problems with that, though, is that the game of Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition does not equally balance the different elemental options that there are. Fire is the most widely applicable damage type that you'll probably have the most spells that you can play into, but it's also one of the most resisted and immune damage types available to monsters in Dungeons & Dragons. If you pick any of the other options, you're going to have very limited spell options. Now, there are some ways around this by picking the right feats or abilities or certain items that, especially with some of the additions in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, that do actually present a better option for the Draconic Bloodline Sorcerer. Now, one of my problems is that with the errata on the Elemental Affinity, it actually makes that ability much worse. Initially, I wanted to give this subclass an A, but I actually feel that reading over it and with the errata, and unless you have the right items and take the right feats, it actually sits more at a B for me. The B being that if you play it the right way, take the right damage type, are playing in a campaign where that damage type is relevant, and you take something like Elemental Adept. And now with the transmuted spell meta magic that was added in Tasha's, there are options here that present a great Blaster Mage playstyle that could excel in a lot of various campaigns. But there's also a lot of options here that might be detrimental to a player who's excited about the Draconic Bloodline Sorcerer, and so there is a chance that this actually plays worse than presented.
I agree with you, Kelly, and I think B is the fairest ranking to give this. If you play a green or black or copper dragon sorcerer who's associated with acid or poison, you do not have a lot of spells, and you're going to be relying on that transmuted spell meta magic to even use your elemental affinity ability. And if you chose that, I think that makes it a D ranking. The stock of this subclass in particular could rise if there was a book in the future that introduced a ton of spells that were not fire damage. Because even with the transmuted spell meta magic, you're now paying a tax of sorcery points to get spells to do the damage type that you want them to deal that works with your power. And straight up, the math is not in your favor. If you want to transmute a spell into your favorite damage type to get extra damage, that costs you 1 sorcery point. But on a straight up trade deal level, you would have been better using the empowered spell meta magic to just re-roll the die rolls, right? And now, interestingly enough, you can actually use both meta magics on the same spell, but now you've tied up 2 meta magic choices and 2 sorcery points to make Fireball into Poison Ball. The strongest one that has the most support is the Fire Dragon. And so you can end up with a spell of every single level that does fire damage. You can take Burning Hands, you can take Scorching Ray, you can take Fireball, you can take Wall of Fire. The list goes on and on and on. You have something almost at every level that is doing fire damage. But then, of course, you fight a red dragon, or a fire elemental, or demons, or devils. And even if you take elemental affinity, that's not going to help you against the immunity that many of these creatures have. So I think that in the wrong campaign, this actually gets really bad. So this is a subclass that, you know, when you build it in the most logical way, take every fire damage dealing spell, it's actually a pretty mediocre character. And so I think that that's why a B ranking is very fair for this. I don't even think it's the best way to play a blaster as a sorcerer. I think that title goes to the Divine Soul. The armor, the extra hit points, the flying speed are all great. The charisma check could be relevant. The resistance is okay. The extra damage is okay. The Dragon Fear power at level 18 is completely irrelevant because you're going to be concentrating on something else.
Being able to fly is a great ability, and I think that's actually one of the best things this gets. It's a flying sorcerer is far scarier than a non-flying sorcerer. Mm-hmm. But there's a presentation here of a blaster mage that could be so much fun and a very rewarding experience at the table. But it really depends on a lot of factors and a lot of choices that are made during your spells, your meta magics, which dragon bloodline you chose, and how those all play together. And it makes it a really big variable on whether this is going to work in the campaign you're setting out for, or whether it's going to bomb really hard.
All right, folks, it's time to get weird. Now we've got the Wild Magic Sorcerer.
The Wild Magic Sorcerer really pulls on these raw elements of magic, fueling their body and coming out in uncontrollable ways, which can be really exciting at the table. Let's take a look at what they get.
So the very core feature of the Wild Magic Sorcerer is the wonderfully impressive and one of my favorite things in the entire game, the Wild Magic Surge table. This is a D100 table, and the way that this works is starting right away at first level, whenever you cast a sorcerer spell of first level or higher, the DM can be like, you're rolling a D20, buddy. And if you roll a 1, you get to roll on the Wild Magic Surge table. You roll that D100, and you see what happens.
Now, yes, there are terrible things that can happen on the Wild Magic table, and there are wonderful things that can happen on the Wild Magic table. What a lot of people don't realize is this actually breaks down in favor of the Wild Magic character. If you look at the table and you break down the effects that are beneficial, the effects that are negative, and the effects that fall somewhere in the middle and are strictly cosmetic or fun, what you actually end up with is an 80% chance, give or take, that something not bad is going to happen, which is pretty great.
There are only about 10 that are definitively not good. Things like fireballing yourself, turning into a potted plant, turning into a sheep. The rest of them are benign or positive. And under normal circumstances, even if the Dungeon Master makes you roll every single time you cast a spell, there's still only a 5% chance the surge actually happens.
At first level, you also gain the ability Tides of Chaos. You can take advantage on a saving throw, ability check, or attack roll, and you can't use this ability again until you take a long rest. Anytime that you cast a spell of first level or higher after you've used this feature, the DM can have you roll a D100 to determine the Wild Magic Surge that happens, in which case you now gain the feature back automatically. And in my opinion, this should always happen. It's way more fun when this always happens. You're basically trading the advantage roll for a Wild Magic Surge.
We have played in a campaign where the sorcerer was basically rolling advantage on every single attack roll, ability check, and saving throw they made, so that every single spell they cast was triggering a Wild Magic Surge. It was awesome. Starting at level 6, you also gain the Bend Luck feature. How this ability works is that when you see another creature that makes an attack roll, an ability check, or a saving throw, you can spend 2 sorcery points and use your reaction and roll a d4. You can then apply the results of that d4 as a bonus or a penalty, your choice, to the roll that creature just made. and that is applied before the outcome is determined of the roll.
At 14th level, you gain Controlled Chaos, so if we are playing into the Wild Magic Surge table, you now get to roll twice and pick which one is going to be the best for you, which really weighs the options of it being a good Wild Magic Surge in your favor.
Finally, at 18th level, you gain the Spell Bombardment feature. When you roll damage for a spell, and you get the maximum result on a die, you can roll that die again and add it to the damage. You can only do this once per turn, however. Kelly and I have made no illusions about our biases with wild magic on this channel. We love it. We think it is so cool, it is so flavorful, it is so much fun. And if you've watched our Dungeons of Drackenheim or Shadows of Drackenheim campaign, we are busting out those D100 tables. We made our custom tables for different effects. We love weird and random stuff, and we have enjoyed it immensely in our campaigns. But I think it's really important to acknowledge that some people utterly and completely hate this and find it disruptive and awful. Still, I think all these features are amazing. And if you have a dungeon master that is going to engage with these abilities and make those rolls happen, and that who isn't afraid of the table, that makes you roll the D20 every time, and does this interplay that we talked about of Tides of Chaos, where it's like, yeah, have advantage on all your rolls, Wild Magic Sorcerer, but I'm going to have you roll on the table every single time you cast a spell. It's a lot of fun. And the other features like Bend Luck and Spell Bombardment are actually really beneficial and have a lot of cool applications. And Controlled Chaos just turns the odds of that Wild Magic Surge table completely in your favor. I personally, my gut wants to give this an S tier because I love it so much and I think it's so unique and fun, and what it does at the table is shapes gameplay in a way that is ultimately positive. But I can't in good conscience give it an S tier ranking because I acknowledge that some people utterly and completely hate this chaos. And from an objective lens, this subclass puts the onus on whether or not those Wild Magic Surge rolls happen on the Dungeon Master. I'm really torn. I want to give this an A, at least. I really want to give it at least an A, because I think it's good. I think it adds a lot to the Sorcerer class, like a lot of actual strength. And, you know, it's like kind of that chaos is a ladder. Introducing chaos into combat encounters, introducing chaos into the world so often works out in the party's favor. And even in the circumstances where someone turned into a sheep or a potted plant, it felt like that worked out.
It also felt like the most memorable moments in the campaign.
It did, and you can't. I can't discount the fact that like this class is a generator of memorable moments.
Yeah, I think we need to establish something here. People watching this episode are going to see both of us rank this very highly, and we need to acknowledge that this may not be the case at your table. This subclass might suck for you and your table. Be very aware of that. The fact is, we have had several wild magic characters in our one-shots, in our homebrew campaign.
We had a campaign where Joe played from first level to 16th, 17th level, a wild magic sorcerer. And it was awesome. It was probably the standout character of that campaign.
So let's break this down. If we're looking at the way that we look at the wild magic versus the way that other people might look at the wild magic sorcerer, it takes into account what the DM is going to allow. A lot of this class actually specifies that the DM gets to determine whether or not you're making the dice roll. So right there, it's now in the DM's hands. Does the player playing the character enjoy the gamble of wild magic? There is a small chance of something bad happening or something ridiculous happening, and some people do not like that play style. The next thing to take into account is, what about the rest of the players at the table? Do they hate the gamble of this player using the wild magic table? Does getting fireballed, the small chance of that happening, does that ruin the game for your table? All of these things need to be taken into account, and there are people out there who could argue that this is a D-ranked subclass, and I cannot argue against that because that is a strong opinion about the way that it works at your table. Really, I could argue that this is an S tier, A tier, B tier, C tier, or D tier, completely dependent on who's playing it and what's going on. And that's something that we need to acknowledge, that the Wild Magic Sorcerer is actually probably the hardest subclass to rank because it depends so much on all aspects of the game. At our table, with either of us DMing, we drive hard for that wild magic, and people high five and cheer whenever something at the table ridiculous happens.
But let's look at it, because the way we ran the Wild Magic Soul Sorcerer was every opportunity we had to roll on that table, we took it. Which meant that Joe's character was basically making almost every roll he made that was important with advantage, because he could just summon up advantage. And whenever he did that, I was like, yeah, the next spell that you're casting, we're rolling on that table. So that ability was constantly working. It was just meant that he was rolling on this table every time he cast a spell. But as we discussed, when you actually look at the table and you catalog it, the odds are in the player's favor. Quite overwhelmingly so. 80% of the things on this table are not bad things. 50% of the things on this table are definitely good or beneficial. So that actually means that 50% of the time, every time the player casts a spell, they're getting an extra effect on top of their basic spell. And there's a 1 in 5 chance you get something that's bad.
And the thing is, even at our table when those bad things happened, I will never forget being fireballed at 3rd level. Was I devastated in the moment? Yes. Is it one of my favorite memories from D&D? Also, yes.
I will never forget the time that Joe turned into a potted plant.
We were running around.
You were running away from a death knight, and he turned into a potted plant.
Yeah, and we had to pick him up and just haul ass, carrying Joe the potted plant with us till we were at safety. It was great. So even the bad things were great moments at our table. And again, this depends on the table. So I give it an A as well. So I think at the end of the day, we're giving the Wild Magic Sorcerer an A ranking. But please be aware that you need to acknowledge your DM and the way that they are going to run the Wild Magic Sorcerer, whether or not you're okay with the Wild Magic table, and whether or not the group that you're playing with is as well. And if you acknowledge all of that, then you can determine whether or not this is a great subclass to play at the table. And there's a chance it's not. There's a chance that this is a D-ranked subclass, and it's going to not be fun at all for anyone.
So why don't we give it a conditional A with a rainbow ranking to acknowledge the spectrum of opinion surrounding this class?
Yeah, because we say that B can also excel in the right campaign or not be great, but I feel like this is almost wider than a B. Up on the screen right now, you see our rankings for these two subclasses, but let's take a look at what our community thought and how much it differs from our opinion of wild magic.
So with the Draconic Bloodline Sorcerer, we see approximately 17% of respondents giving it an S tier ranking, with 46% of respondents giving it an A tier ranking and 28.8% giving it a B tier, with just a sliver, about 5% in the C tier and almost no D tier rankings, only about 1%. Overwhelmingly positive from the community. This speaks to that classic community wisdom which holds true that the Fire Dragon is a great blaster, great damage dealer, overall I think the favorite of the two from the player's handbook, by and large, if you look at the wider community. People enjoy their Draconic Bloodline Sorcerers.
Yeah, and I think I can see the argument for it being A tier, but the thing to take into account is that there are options here that are weaker than others. But overall, it's a great blaster sorcerer. As we move on to the Wild Magic Sorcerer, this is the most split subclass we have seen yet in our rankings, and I think that is a fair assessment. Again, we gave it an A, but really our argument is that you can give it any of them and make a valid argument for that. Of all the sorcerer subclasses, this one received the most D rankings, which I don't even disagree with, but I think it entirely depends on the playstyle, and so I think the great question is not do you agree with our ranking, but where do you rank the Wild Magic Sorcerer, because I feel like it's going to be different for every group and every person.
Some of the respondents to our poll talked about how the Wild Magic Sorcerer feels disruptive. It feels like it is endemic of a problem player style behavior, of selfish gameplay, of taking unnecessary risks with your party. Again, our analysis, we look at it as this is actually very strongly in the player's favor. But for many people, they don't like the idea of gambling with the party's fate at all whatsoever, and that's totally valid.
I think really at the end of the day, do you love chaos? We do. We
Yeah.
love chaos. So we love the Wild Magic Sorcerer. Other people don't love the gambles or the chaos, and it's not a great class for those people.
Several of our community comments acknowledged that the Wild Magic Sorcerer is DM dependent as well. Both Tides of Chaos as well as the Wild Magic Surge are at the DM's discretion whether or not they are activated or not, which is a very big factor and I think makes the B overall of a deserved ranking. But others at the same time said that the Wild Magic Sorcerer was the most fun they ever had playing D&D.
So up on screen right now, you will see our rankings for these two Sorcerer subclasses presented in the Player's Handbook, and next to that you will see the community rankings. I find both of these subclasses to have very interesting analysis of what they offer because they offer something very specific to a certain type of player and group. So this has been a look at our tier rankings for Sorcerer subclasses Part 1 in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Tell us your thoughts on these two subclasses in the comments below.
Check out our follow-up videos in Part 2 where we'll be covering the subclasses available in Xanathar's Guide to Everything. And then the new subclasses introduced in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything will be in the forthcoming Part 3 once we've had a little bit of time to play the new subclasses. The videos that we create on our channel are made possible thanks to the incredible generosity of our Patreon community. From both Kelly and I to all of you out there on Patreon, thank you for making the work that we do here on YouTube possible. If you enjoy our show, please consider joining us on Patreon by following the links in the description below to contribute to the show.
You also might be interested to hear that our live campaign Dungeons of Drackenheim is coming to Kickstarter. We've partnered with Ghostfire Games to bring this campaign to life as a 5th edition module. You can follow the links down below to stay up to date on information regarding this Kickstarter. Also, don't forget to check out our live play in the Worlds of Drackenheim, which airs Tuesday nights at 6 p.m. Eastern at twitch.tv/dungeon_dudes. You can find all the previous episodes of that show right up over here.
And we are making our way ranking all the subclasses in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. You can find the full playlist of all those episodes for every class and subclass right up over here.
Please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you next time
in the dungeon.